So great to be here today. I'm so glad that you all are here for this conversation and so excited to get this information out to the audience that's here. And I know that I have been so excited for this panel and all of the amazing information that you all are going to offer. But I find that, usually at the beginning of these kind of panels, it's great to give a little bit of an introduction of kind of who's on the panel, so that the audience has an idea of who are these people that I'm listening to right now. So I can start off, and then I think it could be great if we all go around and maybe give a short little kind of blurb of our name and who we are. But I'm Madeline Baldwin. I am the founder and host of the Gen Z Girlies podcast. So we help Gen Z women and non-binary individuals build careers and lives they love. So I know that I see a couple familiar faces on this call. I know I've chatted with a few of you all. But if we maybe want to start with Natalie, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll kind of bring it round circle and we can take off from there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Natalie Neptune. I'm a top LinkedIn voice for Next Gen Z, and I'm also a Penn State University civil engineering student. And I currently work for a Norwegian startup called Crowdworks as the platform community manager. So I do a lot of things between, talking about Gen Z trends, global community trends, and also big things about venture capital.
Amazing. Thanks, Natalie, for giving that intro. That's so exciting, hearing a little bit about your background. And Sarah, I'd love for maybe you to jump in and quickly introduce yourself, and we can maybe do the Gen Z side, and then we'll jump over to the HR leader side and do it like that for the introductions.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. I'm Sarah Romanko. I've been involved with the startup and VC ecosystem since 2019. And since then, I've had roles at various companies as a venture fellow, venture intern, venture analyst, venture capital associate, and VC advisor. In these roles, I've had the opportunity to interact with early stage startups in a variety of industries, exploring different trends. I've also had the opportunity to evaluate, to meet with the startups, write investment memos. But what was really exciting is most recently, I was selected to evaluate proposals for the South by Southwest conference. And then I was also on Able Partners Gen Z advisory board where I evaluated Gen Z trends. I'm really excited to hearing some more insights from everybody on this panel.
That's awesome, Sarah. Thanks for giving that background in the South by Southwest. That's so cool. I actually didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, now that we've kind of, gotten our Gen Z leaders out of the way, I'd love to move over to, the HR leader introductions. And so, Lisa, why don't we jump down to you? And I'd love to hear a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lisa Frisha. Excuse me. I'm a fractional chief people officer, strategic advisor, and leadership coach. I kind of came sideways into HR through education, first as a middle school history teacher, then as a founding high school principal, and then found my way into talent, first through leadership development and then making the rounds. And so work with small and growing organizations, usually mission-driven ones, that are trying to align strategy, talent, and equity in a sustainable way, because they don't, everyone's wearing 3 different hats in those types of organizations. And so having really strong talent systems that align really encourage and highlight and support people in doing and then living the values so that they're not just something on a website. Yeah, that's me.
That's perfect. I mean, it's really cool to hear, I think, both the Gen Z side, but then also, the backgrounds that we're all bringing, I think is really, really exciting. And, and then certainly last but not least, Dieter, if you want to jump in and maybe give a little bit of who you are and your background as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maddie, and welcome to the other panel members as well. My name is Dr. Dieter Veldsman, so I'm the Chief HR Scientist at the Academy to Innovate HR. We're an organization passionate about the future of HR and building the skills and capabilities that people need to be prepared for the future of work. I'm an ex-Chief People Officer, used to work in various capacities in talent, organizational development, as well as in organizational design. So really looking forward to the conversation and to the different views around the table.
Well, awesome. Well, it is so great to have you all here and to hear a little bit about, kind of the different perspectives and backgrounds that I think you all are bringing to this conversation. I think that it's going to be really, really interesting and really helpful, for everyone in the audience who's tuned in as well. And to the audience, thank you so much for being here today. I think that this is something I've been looking forward to, and I hope you have been as well. And I know that this is going to be a great conversation. So kind of just to maybe jump right into what we're talking about today is, the topic of the conversation is Gen Z Speaks, are HR leaders listening? And so we're talking a little bit about, what HR is like in the Gen Z perspective and the performance reviews that, kind of encompass what that looks like in the workplace today. And so I know one of the first things that I thought could be helpful for us to kind of jump into and discuss is, kind of what the trends of performance reviews right now in the workplace are like. And I know that there's been a little bit of a shift currently towards how those have been moving into more of a dialogue-driven approach. And so I'd love to maybe hear a little bit about your all's opinions and thoughts kind of on that and how that has been shifted and what that kind of transition has looked like. And let's go ahead and start with maybe the HR side, and then we'll bring in some of the Gen Zers as well. So Lisa, maybe if you wanna jump off, if you have anything to say about this. If not, we can of course move to Dieter, but would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on kind of what those dialogue-driven approaches have looked like and how those have been relating to Gen Z.
Yeah, so I think that this is definitely a hot topic since I've spent the last 6 months with clients, either doing some version of creating performance evaluations, training managers. I think there's a few things that I've noticed. I think, one is that I see organizations really starting to invest in managers in a different way. I know many of us in HR have been beating that drum for a while, but seeing people realize, oh, wait a second, we really need to invest because our managers are not equipped. And that's a combination of things. I think the way of managing is changing to be more feedback driven, more dialogue, more of an emphasis on coaching. And there's just a lot of new leaders given COVID and the transitions that have taken place as well. So definitely an emphasis there. I think that, and I think more of an effort. I know that whether you have performance reviews or some people are saying it's broken, get rid of annual reviews. I don't agree with that, but I do agree that an annual review should not be a surprise. If I'm talking to you during the step back, it shouldn't be a surprise. It should be more of a reflection. And I see more of an emphasis on that. And I think the last thing I'd say is really starting to think through better indicators so that there's a shared language that we've also audited to make sure that the terms are equitable and inclusive. I see more of a shift to really creating some shared language when we're talking about performance.
Yeah, thank you so much for that take. And I love what you kind of said about, shared language and what it looks like to make sure that, when going into performance reviews, that these aren't necessarily going to be surprises, and kind of what that trend has looked like within performance reviews moving more that direction. Dieter, I'd love to know, is this kind of experience the same on your end? And have you experienced these same trends, or what is going on in your mind about this topic?
Yeah, I think maybe to build on what Lisa has mentioned, I think we've definitely seen people taking a step back and saying, how do we simplify the performance management process, and how do we understand what it's really about? And it's really, 3 things for me that's important there. It's about creating clarity in terms of work. So what does good look like? What is the expectation of people, especially when we start thinking about new ways that people will work or need to get together or need to collaborate with each other. The second one is it's around consistency. And when I talk about consistency, to Lisa's point, you don't want a surprise at the end of the annual review. You want continuous conversations that drives continuous feedback that helps people in the moment. And then the last component is it has to be linked to consequence. Now, consequence, some people have a very negative connotation with the word, but in the performance world, it has to have both a positive and a developmental connotation to it. A lot of organizations are saying, performance process that stands in isolation and doesn't lead towards reward, doesn't motivate people. So then why does it really matter? So the conversation I'm seeing very much from a trend point of view is performance happening in the context of what works in that particular organization, driving the culture, driving the values. As well as then my last point is really making sure that we get robust feedback from a variety of stakeholders. We're also starting to see that people work in various different ways. So they work in different teams. They've got various matrix reporting relationships. How do we make sure that when we do have a conversation about performance and development, that it's holistic and that the manager is equipped and enabled to have the right conversation, which is also something that Lisa mentioned. So I think exciting times. I'm a firm supporter of performance management. However, I'll be the first to admit that it is a love-hate relationship. So there is some work that we need to do.
Absolutely. Yes. No. And I think that those points are so important as well. And I'd love to hear, from Natalie and Sarah as well, maybe jumping to Natalie for a moment. And what has kind of been your experience with, have you seen any shifts kind of in performance reviews, or have they been pretty static since you've kind of been in the workforce, or what does that look like for you? And have you seen those dialogue driven kind of approaches and that consistency of what those have looked like within your work as well?
Yeah. So, like as someone that's Gen Z, I'm 23, like we're really big on valuing like open communication, feedback loops, and also a lot of regular check-ins. Because kind of like the traditional annual reviews are actually kind of seen as outdated and ineffective. And I would like to give one key example. For example, I worked for Seven Wire Ventures. It's a digital health fund firm in Chicago. And they had a really good system of making sure as an intern doing check-ins like every couple weeks with basically the person that hired me. And it was like, as you said, dialogue driven. And we went out to lunch actually. Local, we walked out, had lunch, and I had to come with 3 things that I needed to work on and 3 things that I wanted to learn. And then he would come back with 3 things that he think I could need improvement and 3 things that he really liked. So I really like this approach. And then going into like a company everyone knows, Microsoft, I know they place annual reviews with being more fluid and focus on like goals and feedback system. So that allowed for like more continuous dialogue and like real-time adjustments.
I love that. I think it's so interesting. And I really like what you kind of said about you went out to lunch and you kind of made that personal connection as well. And that kind of helped you, have that dialogue that needed to be there of, what goals do I need to work on? And then also, opened up the room for there to be room for some healthy criticism, but in a way that's constructive. And I think that, it can be often easy to mistake constructive criticism with just criticism. And so I think that what you were saying about kind of making that personal relationship and going out that way that sounds so helpful, and kind of what those trends are starting to look like on that end. And Sarah, I would love to hear a little bit from you. Are there any like specific trends that you've kind of seen in the performance review world, or any insights that you can share with us on how you're seeing that kind of change and ways that could move forward?
I definitely agree with Natalie on the sense that we're moving away from only having annual reviews. I think it really speaks to the fact that as Gen Z, we really value that open communication. And one thing that I think I really enjoyed was in one of my previous VC fellowships, instead of just checking in like, every several months, it was like every week we would go in, I would meet with the person I was working with, we would review my work, she would ask if I had any concerns. And I think that just really spoke to how much they cared about the people they were working with, making sure that they felt valued. And I think that, that's very important to Gen Z because, ultimately we want to feel valued. We want to feel like things are going well. And I think it's also just that open communication that Natalie mentioned, because, if you just say, hey, like, can we have a meeting? That's something that's very stressful for Gen Z. If you just out of nowhere say like, hey, we need to meet. And so giving that context when you're setting up the meeting makes such a huge difference.
I totally agree. I mean, I think even in my own life, I've seen the same thing with meetings. So it's really cool to hear, both the different perspectives on my fellow Gen Zs, but then also some of the HR leaders, in the HR community and what those performance reviews look like. And I know that we've touched now a little bit kind of on, what the qualitative side maybe looks like of, we've had these conversations, we're kind of coming up with some of our goals, and we've made these like personal connections in these, these performance reviews. But another thing that I know is often very important that typically backs up a lot of those qualitative conversations is also the quantitative data that kind of goes behind work performance and what that looks like with, just what your performance is in the workplace. And so I'd love to know a little bit about maybe your all's kind of takes on how do you balance that qualitative conversation of making those connections and having that, that criticism, that good criticism that comes with that, but also backing that up with kind of the quantitative data that goes behind that, but keep not making that quantitative data too scary and too numbers based for someone who may not be leaning that way. And so let's switch it up a little bit and let's actually go backwards. And Sarah, I'd love to maybe start with you on that end.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually been thinking about this a lot. So, one of my previous full-time roles, I worked in real estate, and I actually worked with a lot of data. And so, interestingly enough, so rather than only doing annual performance reviews, when we were reviewing my work, we would actually use the data that I created and review that, and ultimately see how that was, like, if that was effective, if it was meeting the standards of the company in terms of the work that I was doing. And we were using that data as data to evaluate my performance, also along with evaluating the questions that I was asking in the work that I was doing, because ultimately what I was doing was I was analyzing single family residential real estate properties. And so I was analyzing data in my role, but I was also asking questions to understand, how we were evaluating the data, right? So there was two parts. And so ultimately we were taking that approach in my not my performance review, but my check-in, in the before having a performance review, right? Just to understand the work that I was doing.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Sarah. I think that's so helpful, kind of hearing a little bit about how, like the background of your work also kind of, and with being numbers based, kind of influence how you approach that as well. And Natalie, I'd love to jump to you on that end as well. And if you have any input or insights separate from Sarah.
Yeah, a little bit about me. I've worked in kind of the academia space, and I worked for a lot of startups. So I think it's a little bit different than working for maybe like a public company, like I mentioned, like Microsoft or something like that. So we didn't have things like SMART goals or performance metrics or like KPIs to help like track our progress and like quantify achievements kind of thing. So a big thing was kind of just like people would just DM each other like, oh, things that worked good, things that worked bad kind of things. There weren't those solid metrics that more established, I think maybe Series A, B, C startups may have or public companies may have. So yeah.
Absolutely, definitely. Thank you, Natalie. And Dieter and Lisa, do you have any inputs, either of you, on kind of this side as well? I'd love to hear from either of you that feels ready to jump on in.
Sure. I'd say I think it's complicated and every organization is struggling with this on some level. I think one thing I'd like to, you made a comment earlier just about how some folks aren't, necessarily quantitative driven, right? That's not how their brains work. And I think, obviously you want to be respectful of it, but I think there's also a responsibility for educating folks on what data is and what data could look like, so that I think the benefit of having established metrics or, well-written competencies is that now we're defining success in the right way so that you're not blindsided. I see it very much as an equity issue, because you might be saying, well, I'm doing well at this thing, but this is the thing that's actually going to like make or break the organization. And if we're not using the same language, that's where a lot of this goes left. And I think, as a manager, I think you want to talk about both, right? If you have someone hitting sales goals, but they're a jerk and, against all the cultural values you stated, that is not someone who is successful. So how do you talk about how whatever the competencies, cultural values are informing your work and how that might help you be better, right? If you're more collaborative, then maybe you're selling the right product and, consumers are, not upset with what they're getting or whatever the thing is. But I think you have to tell the story to folks. And I think that both go hands in hand.
Absolutely. I love what you were saying too about what you said earlier about, having that language and that similar language that everyone kind of understands, and relating that also to that quantitative side of the data, I think is really important and interesting, and not a topic I've heard a lot about. So I love that point of view as well. And I'm wondering, Dieter, do you have anything to add on to that as well?
I think from my side, you have to utilize both. And I think very often in the past where people have only used one or the other, they both have limitations that they bring towards the practice and the process, right? So I think, as Lisa has mentioned, if you don't use the quantitative side, I think it's difficult to ground things in a consistent way. And it's very difficult then to also help people understand what does good look like and what does progress look like. If you don't have the qualitative side, I think you then run into the challenge that has happened in the past where people feel like you've marginalized them to a number. You are a 3, you are a exceed performance, right? Which doesn't really help either. So I think that blend helps you bring robustness to the process. I think it gives a lot more depth. And I do think if you utilize both of those, it does actually then lead towards a much better conversation that you can have in the moment around where we can improve and what are some of the things that we can do differently and what type of support do you require. So I would be very careful, and I know some organizations, especially today, that are extremely metrics and data driven, they sometimes ignore the qualitative side, but also then organizations on the other side that sometimes say quantitative metrics are too prescriptive. They almost go towards completely the other side and say, oh, it's just about us talking about this, which is also not great. So you have to find that middle point that really positions this in the context of your organization and what's going to work for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think going off of that as well, which I think kind of the overarching trend of kind of what I'm hearing from everyone is it really is a balance, and it's how do we approach, both the qualitative and the quantitative side, while, also taking into mind who the person is that we're speaking of and, relating to them on like a personal level. And so I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from you all, at least on the idea of kind of what are these trends that are taking over, the performance review world right now. And especially, the idea of moving from the annual model to maybe more of a continuous conversation and that feedback loop and what that looks like. And, and I think that as we're talking about these trends that are kind of changing what performance reviews look like in, the work world right now, is there are so many changes, in just what the corporate world looks like, what the startup world looks like, what the freelancing world looks like right now. And one of those really big ones, I think, is the rise of the hybrid and the remote work kind of model. I think we've all kind of experienced that in our lives. We either have work jobs, we know people who are working those jobs, and those new areas can always, present a challenge of something new to learn, a new way to approach something. And especially with performance reviews, of even, Natalie, your example of going out to lunch, and sometimes in a remote, environment that might not be possible. And sometimes that might not even be possible in a hybrid remote necessarily. And so I'd love to kind of know, what are some of the challenges that you all have faced kind of in dealing with that? And then, but also, have there been any opportunities that have emerged in this context? And how has that kind of shaped not just the trends, but just performance reviews and the workplace in general? And Lisa, let's go ahead and jump down to you if you want to kick off this conversation as well.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll start with the opportunity, which is that I think it's forcing people to get clearer about what success looks like, because we're not going to be seeing people in the office in the same way that we did. And not that that was a good thing beforehand. Let me be very, very clear, because there's a tremendous amount of proximity bias. But I think what I've seen folks trying to do is really say, what do we mean when we say this is excellent? Is this the right metric? That's number one. And two, like, I'm working with an organization right now that we own the fact that a manager has limited insight. And so how do we collect more and more data, whether that's 360s, customer feedback, like really articulating data flows, so that, yeah. And really actually emphasizing the self-evaluation, that it's not just a thing you do. And I think that's when I was entering the workforce, the self-eval was sort of a dog and pony show, but actually, how do you use that to be able to create a dialogue? I think the data piece is not one we've figured out, but I think people are trying.
And I love that. And I think that, that comes along with, the turf of anything new is you have to try things until you figure out what's the best approach and what's the best way to do this. And I love, kind of you bringing in the, how do we self-evaluate and what does it look like to be more, self-aware, and how the job we're doing and kind of what that looks like within the context of a performance review. And Sarah, I'd love to hear, do you have any kind of insights on what the change of hybrid work and remote work has done to the world of performance reviews?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked in hybrid roles. I've also worked in remote roles. I think ultimately it comes down to body language. That's something that I've really thought about, because when you're working entirely remote, I remember some roles I've had where I've never actually met the people I'm working with in person, and I think that presents a new challenge, right? Because when you're interacting with people and you only see them on screen, you're only seeing their face, right? They're not seeing their hand movement. They're not seeing how they're sitting, and I think that really speaks to, okay, are they telling me something that's positive, or are they telling me something that's negative? And so it's a lot harder to understand the the tone and everything that they're conveying, and ultimately that affects the conversation, because if you perceive that they're acting negative towards you, you may take feedback differently. And so I think it's important, because as Gen Z, you know, we want people to be honest, we want them to be transparent, but if we take things the wrong way, that would affect ultimately how we perform in the future. And then, you know, that also goes into well-being, right? So I think really it's just kind of understanding how can you build these relationships with people remotely and in a hybrid environment, because it's extremely difficult, but there's also a lot of benefits as well.
I really like what you're saying about, you know, there are the challenges, but there are also those benefits, and it's kind of figuring out how do we balance those. And I know we'll touch on it in a minute on kind of what mental health and well-being looks like in the workplace, but I think that that's a really astute to kind of bring that into the conversation of that hybrid and remote work is that for a lot of people. So we can continue touching on that in a minute. But Dieter, I'd also love to hear a little bit about maybe your experiences or your opinions on this new kind of work model that is kind of growing in the workplace right now.
Yeah, I think to agree with what Lisa's mentioned, I think it's definitely driven a much more outcomes-based approach towards giving feedback pertaining to performance. And I think to equip and enable leaders and managers to have different types of conversations, because you are not able to observe certain types of behavior like Sarah has mentioned. So I think that's definitely shifted quite a bit. I do want to make one other comment though, whereas I think there's been a very big learning. The moment that everybody shifted working remotely, there was this newfound fascination all of a sudden with productivity and what productivity looks like, and big questions around transparency and what is actually being monitored and privacy and all those types of elements. And I think there's been some major lessons learned in that particular space around how do you utilize the performance process to actually build trust between the employee and the manager, as well as with the organization. So to be extremely transparent about, you know, what is being tracked, what is being monitored, what is being measured, and not to dive into that type of conversation. You know, when I say that type of conversation, to actually be much more upfront around how is this going to work? How do we clarify what our mutual expectations are? Because I think there was a lot of organizations that burnt their fingers there, and it did significant damage to the relationship and the culture of the organization. I'd love to believe that we are past that. So I think it was a temporary kind of a mistake a lot of organizations made, but it did highlight the fact that when working remotely, trust is important. Clarity and expectations is important. Frequent engagement is important. And then as well as the fact that be very, very clear on what success looks like. Those things are crucial to get that right in a remote working environment.
I absolutely agree. And I think that brings up a really interesting point too, as well as how we were talking about, you know, balancing that qualitative and quantitative kind of data, but how using that is helpful, not just in performance reviews, but also and even before the performance reviews with, you know, setting those expectations and, you know, letting them know here's what's expected. And so they kind of already have, you know, that base level of here's what needs to happen, you know, going into those performance reviews. And Natalie, I'd love to hear as well, as far as the same topic, you know, the changes in the world with hybrid and, you know, remote. Have you had any of these experiences? What are your takeaways from these new changes?
Yeah, well, there's like two specific changes that I noticed. Number one, like everyone touched upon, is the focus on outcomes. So really measuring like the results and impact focus instead of like that term micromanaging, like specific work hours. And it's interesting actually. Two is like increase like asynchronous communication using like tools like, you know, performance management software for like feedback and documentation. So people use Slack and a lot of other different resources to kind of like manage performance. I think a really good example is actually Spotify. They implemented like a remote first performance review process, and they set really clear like expectation, regular check-ins, and like virtual collaboration tools and stuff like that. So those are like some kind of ways I see performance reviews have like adapted and evolved a little bit for the remote work.
Absolutely. And I love that example of Spotify, and kind of, you know, hearing that side is always so interesting to, you know, hear these companies that are, you know, being really change makers and putting these things into, you know, motion in the industry. And we did also kind of covering the topic of still remote and hybrid. We did have a question from Josie from the audience, and she was kind of wondering what are some of the HR tech and, you know, systems that you like to use. And I think Natalie maybe heard a few kind of ways that some companies have implemented that from you. But Dieter and Lisa, do you have any favorite systems that you find are helpful in this way?
I probably am a little bit of a dinosaur in that I think that the best feedback is just giving it. And I think that any tech system is going to be as good or as bad. A tech system is going to amplify your strengths or your weaknesses. So I don't there's goods and there's positives and negatives to a lot of different systems, but when it comes to actual coaching and when it comes to actual feedback, if you don't train managers on what that effective feedback is, it doesn't matter what platform you're using. I have seen some platforms, especially with like Greenhouse on the ATS side, do like those nudges as you're writing feedback to just be like, are you sure you want to use that word? So I think anything that incorporates that can be helpful, but I don't think the tech is going to save us.
Absolutely. Lisa, I think that's a great answer, and I think kind of what we were talking about, as well with this rise of hybrid, and remote is that it's a tool, and it's a tool that we can use to give ourselves things that we may not have had access to, like within the work world previously. But ultimately, at the end of the day, your workplace is the people you work with and the way that you interact with others and those relationships that you build. And so, how do we use those tech systems as something to amplify what we have?
Maddie, so maybe just to add to what Lisa's mentioned, I think just to answer Josie's question without calling out any specific technology, but the best that I've seen is something that integrates into the natural way that people work already. I think the moment that it feels like I'm going to a separate system, the way I now talk about performance, that tends to fail a bit because it doesn't integrate, it doesn't feel realistic, and it doesn't incorporate performance as part of the natural things that we do. So the technologies that I've seen that does really make a difference is what integrates into the natural ways of communication that happens in the organizations, or into the natural workflows, or that goes and sits on top of your line of business systems, as opposed to being, this is the performance system or the HR system that I go to. So I would look at that in terms of what are the business systems we utilize, what performance feedback driven technology can sit on top of that, and how can you integrate that in a very, very simple and seamless way.
Absolutely, definitely. And Natalie, do you have anything that you found really helpful? I know that you mentioned a little bit about what Spotify uses, but any systems that you found that companies have used on your end?
Yeah, like for the Norwegian startup I work for now, since obviously I'm not based in Oslo, Norway, we use Miro. That's what a lot we do with performance reviews, and they have a really good system of trying to figure out what we like in our work environment, what we don't like. So having a plus and minuses, and Miro is a really good platform where they have all the kind of like templates to set up HR performance reviews and stuff like that. And going to what, like you were saying, like it really integrates into the natural workflow if your company already uses something like that.
Absolutely, definitely. And yeah, I think all this kind of, feeds back into HR. I really like what you were saying about what are, the natural kind of processes that we use within the workplace, and how can we, replicate those with tech, and how can we amplify kind of what we're doing there. And I know kind of we've talked about, how like remote work and this hybrid new work and this change is kind of really great for kind of what mental health and well-being looks like in the workplace. And Natalie, I know you also mentioned kind of not having those like those set hours, and being able to kind of follow that on whatever way you need to, which works best for you in your life as well. And so I'd love to know kind of just, how do you see like performance reviews being able to play a role in addressing and supporting, employees' mental health like concerns and needs, which I think is a really interesting conversation, just kind of on the side of, what does this like cross look like into? I think for a long time there was, a very strict line between work and personal, but I've found kind of in the workplace that this has been maybe blurring a little bit, and that these have been becoming a little bit more something that's addressed together. And so I'd love to know if you all have any other takes kind of on how this has, been a big part in what are going on in the trends currently coming up. And Sarah, maybe we can start with you if there's been anything on your end that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one really great example is 3M. So, during the pandemic, they, there's a lot of issues, obviously, with people struggling and trying to find people to talk to, but they launched something called the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. And so ultimately it was a way to, give employees a chance to talk to somebody if they needed help, if they felt that, they weren't sure how to address a concern. And I think that plays into performance reviews, because ultimately, maybe sometimes there's a reason that you're not performing well, and it's not something you can necessarily control, like if someone had COVID or there's something going on in your family. Like, I think it's very important to understand that there's other external factors that can control your performance. And, for a manager to be able to treat that in a professional way is very important. And so I think by having this program, the employee talks to a qualified professional, then that person provides advice, and then ultimately the employee has a way to go back to their manager, address the concerns. And similarly, the manager could also talk to somebody and say, hey, I don't know how to address this. Can you help me? And then ultimately it builds trust among the employee and their manager.
Absolutely. Yes. And I really like what you were saying as well about having that trust. And I feel like that has been, kind of underlying a lot of the different conversations and topics that we've covered today is, what does it look like to have that trust? What does it look like to have that relationship? And how does that kind of impact, not just the performance review, but, impacts also, who we are and the way that we work and, our day-to-day life on that end as well. And Natalie, I'd love to hear from you if there's been anything on your end. I really love what you said earlier about, kind of having that async and that remote environment. But have there been any other ways that you've seen performance reviews in particular that have been able to kind of encompass, helping employees with, their mental health and well-being and within their workplace?
Yeah, I know a big one is like Headspace. I know they offer a lot of mental health resources and training to employees through its app and workshops. And as someone, I'm big on focuses on global community building. So I've seen like some companies host kind of like sessions. So these are more like the big, probably public companies like Google and stuff. They kind of host sessions for maybe like Asians or like, for African Americans, and talking about like mental health within those kind of different ethnic groups, because a lot of people have different experiences, that maybe other people from other cultures didn't understand. I think PwC also created like mental health champions program kind of to raise awareness and provide support to colleagues. So I'm big on also focusing on the ethnic groups side of things and the cultural awareness side of things, because that can also affect your mental health and not feeling like you belong.
Absolutely. And Natalie, I really like what you were saying too about, mental health there's so many different kind of strands of where that can come from, and so many different areas that kind of need to be addressed in that way. And if we really start looking at it in a holistic kind of viewpoint and being able to provide resources in different areas and different fields, that can be a great way to kind of bring that conversation, into the workplace as well. And Dieter, I'd love to know, is there anything on your end that you would love to add?
Yeah, I think going beyond, the employee assistance programs, I think I'd like to approach it a little bit more from the performance side. I think there's also, a couple of things that I've seen. I think firstly, it provides an opportunity to have a conversation around what support do you need, to be able to perform. And I think that's sometimes a conversation that we don't pay enough attention to. And it goes both ways, both from a leader to the employee and from the employee to the leader. I think then, yes, there's most definitely, the support networks that we provide around that and other resources that we can also provide. But I think the big thing that I've been seeing is also that there's been a change in the narrative with performance in the past. I think in some organizations has been seen as a little bit of something that is detrimental to well-being. Whereas if you actually manage it really well, it contributes towards the well-being of the individual. And there's a lot of proof there that talks about, satisfaction and engagement and motivation that it leads towards if a performance process and the conversation is managed really well. So I think that narrative has changed quite a bit. So I think it's actually a very, very good, useful tool and approach that you can utilize to improve well-being, because stress around, am I doing well? What are the consequences if I'm not doing well? That's actually very detrimental to well-being. So if you don't manage performance well, it will negatively impact the well-being of the individual.
Absolutely. And Lisa, I see you nodding your head a lot down there. Do you have any thoughts that you'd love to add to what was Dieter saying? And what
I beat this drum often, but I think, clarity is kind, but it also helps to norm. And I think, just to bring in other aspects of it as well, if you do need to have the conversation about accommodations, you actually can't have that conversation thoughtfully if you haven't clearly defined what the role is, right? Because if you're in a client-facing role, that is a very different type of role than if you're coding behind the scenes, and the accommodations are going to look different. And this is so important and involving, I think, an HR person as you're accommodating this, because you want to make sure you're also being equitable to all of your folks, right? So maybe Natalie feels comfortable sharing with me what she's going through and I'm able to accommodate, but Sarah hasn't. And she's like, well, why is Natalie getting this accommodation and I'm not? And so, you want to, and I think this comes from, I've seen it come from such a good place for managers, but managers are not therapists and managers are not necessarily thinking beyond all the time, the one-on-one conversation. And so what you think you're doing well at, what you think is an act of goodwill can have really negative consequences if you're not thinking through it. And so I would just add to leaders, like just making sure you're clear on what the role is and isn't. And then just involving HR and helping you to navigate what can be an accommodation, what isn't. When do you direct somebody to the EAP? I find so many folks not knowing the resources that their organizations give. And so I would just like underscore those points.
Absolutely, Lisa. And I think that's a really important point you were making as well on, being careful about what the role is. And because, we are looking, we do want people, to have these personal connections and to be able to, to relate to one another and understand where people are coming from. But there can be a point where sometimes someone, crosses a little bit of a personal line or, there's a little bit too much on one end. And that can also be detrimental, for someone on that end, and both sides, both ways of, an employee to a manager or a manager to an employee. So, making sure that we are really professional in our relationships and, while extending that goodwill and extending kind of, knowing, here's what the role, here's, the overall of what's included of being careful that stays professional and that doesn't cross a line that could make someone else uncomfortable in any type of way. I think that's a really important conversation to bring up, I think, around just the idea of mental health and well-being and what that can look like as well, for sure. And I think another part that I kind of have heard a little bit maybe from you all, bits and pieces that it kind of came through this last question, but I would love to know a little bit more about the idea of kind of like employee engagement and how that is a big, I think, topic of conversation, currently these days, in in-person environments, but also in like the remote work environments of, how do we boost our employee engagement? How do we get people, talking to one another? How do we get people more involved? And, and I think that this is a really important part of, both high performance, but also having that mental health and well-being and connecting with our coworkers and our peers. And so I'd be really interested in hearing how you all feel that, performance reviews can be designed to, not only necessarily just assess performance and help us get better in that way and maybe in the quantitative way, but how can it also, boost, connection, but also engagement between managers and employees or between employees and employees and kind of just within the workplace? What does, using that to boost engagement look like? And Natalie, maybe let's start off with you this time. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think a big, like some kind of different innovative like strategies, tools that I've seen that work pretty well is like doing like goal setting. So of course, involving your employees in like goal creation to foster overall like the ownership and like commitment. And then of course, like, a big thing is like recognition. I know as Gen Z, I love when my boss says, "Oh my gosh, Natalie, you did such good job with such and such," like. So then I know I like can continue doing that. So like the acknowledging and celebrating achievements, that really helps like boost like, motivation and stuff. I know like Netflix actually uses like a peer-to-peer recognition system. So that's where employees can like publicly recognize like their colleagues for their contributions and stuff like that. So I really like stuff like that. Over at the top of my head, I can think of those.
Natalie, I really like what you're saying kind of about the peer-to-peer recognize systems, to recognize peers. I think that's such a great way that you can, kind of boost that engagement and also like boost those connections and bring people, to work wanting to do a better job in a lot of cases. And Lisa, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, people are engaged when either they are successful at their job or they have a clear idea of what they can do to be successful at their job. And so I think that's level one. But Natalie, you made me think also, right? One practice, and this is obviously from K-12 education, but you can apply it, is, highlighting some of the folks that are really like top in a certain category and having them either showcase something that they're great at. Like if you are really great at, running meetings or leadership or coaching, right? Can that person not just be celebrated, but also do a lunch and learn, right? So that other people can learn this. And then, right, it's also transparent about why this person is being selected for this thing, not just, oh, that's the boss's favorite. So I think there's lots of ways to utilize the performance management system, not just in a one-on-one engaging way, but also as an organization.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you, Lisa. I think those are a lot of great points on that end. And Dieter, I'd love to hear if you have anything, to add to the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think when thinking about engagement, you need to first acknowledge that, performance and recognition, etc., is a human process. It's about two human beings connecting. And I think it can go a little bit broader. And that's why I'm also a big supporter of recognition, praise, appreciation as part of the process, as long as it's done authentically and as long as it's not just done for the sake of it being done. So I think there has to be a sense of authenticity to it. Performance, when done well, is a very, very strong motivator. As Lisa has mentioned, if you know that you're doing well in your job, it's a very key motivator for you to not only do your own job well, but also to contribute and collaborate towards the work of others. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. I know from a tech point of view, a lot of people have kind of been driving, I think like gamification and those types of things. And I think it does make the process fun. And I think it has got a significant impact. However, it is a human process at its heart. And don't forget that there's a human connection that you are trying to foster as part of that engagement and motivational process. So I think about that. I am a very strong supporter of appreciation over recognition, because I think recognition sometimes feel like a bit of a competition, where appreciation is sometimes just the acknowledgement of somebody else contributing in a particular way. And there's a difference. And I think we need to help leaders and managers understand, and Lisa earlier mentioned the competencies. I think it's different to drive in a culture of appreciation as part of performance, and not necessarily only recognition and praise. And it's different tools that you can use in different ways.
Absolutely. And Dieter, I really love what you were saying too about authenticity. And I think that is such an important thing for Gen Z right now, that is in multiple different ways. But I think especially the more authenticity that you can put into the workplace, the more Gen Z are going to want to, to respond to that and to kind of lean in and to engage with that. I think that is a huge thing for Gen Z. And like you were saying, I think with, the difference between appreciation and recognition is that Gen Z is really good at spotting things that aren't authentic from 100 yards off. And so you want where you're at to be somewhere that Gen Z is going to lean into in that way. And Sarah, do you have any thoughts on either authenticity or what employee engagement can look like, or any ways that can be leaned into in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And first I'll speak to the authenticity. I mean, I think that's like a very, very important point, because like in my background, looking at startups and looking at companies that are targeting Gen Z, we really look at like authenticity, right? And so I think it speaks volumes when Gen Z believes a company is authentic, and not only in like how they're portraying themselves externally, but also how they treat their employees. Like that's very important. But really speaking to like a specific example, earlier Natalie mentioned Shopify and their innovative, performance review process. Another really cool point that I wanted to mention was that they, like, part of their performance reviews, they also ask employees to participate in a self-reflection exercise so that they can share their thoughts on growth and self-development. And so ultimately, this is a great approach, because then it can help the employees, have their own needs met. And I think that, a lot of times in performance reviews, it's here's what I as the manager, I identified that you didn't do this well. Here's how you should improve. But if you're actually asking the employee for them to speak on what they think went well, what they think didn't go well, ultimately it's creating that mutual trust, that relationship, and it's a two-way street. And so I think that's a really important thing that a lot of other companies should implement.
Absolutely, Sarah. I totally agree on that, as well as, I've even, I think, seen the trend and see it in my own life as well, is that, Gen Z, they want to be included, and they want to make a difference, and they want to make an impact. And so, giving the room for Gen Z to have a voice, to, be authentic in that way, and for them to kind of lean into that is a great way that I found as well to kind of, up engagement in that way, is if they're realizing that the words that they use and the opinion that they have can make real change. I think that is a great way to approach that in that way. And so I love what you were saying about that, Sarah. And we did have a few questions from the audience, so maybe we can jump into those just for a moment. But and I know one thing that kind of just touching, going from engagement to kind of what Gen Z looks like in the workplace is, one of our audience members wanted to know, how do we at work and how do companies manage kind of distractions as, the rise and rate of Gen Z, working on multiple side gigs is kind of on the rise, and that is a huge trend we're seeing. So what are some ways to maybe mitigate that, but also to, approach that? And I would love, any thoughts that you all have. And anyone feel free to jump in, but Dieter, maybe if you want to start, and then we can see if anyone else has any ideas.
I think there's two things to consider here, right? The first one is that the type of environment that we are working in these days, especially in the digital world, is fraught with distractions. There's so many things happening. There's so many ways to communicate, etc. So one of the key things is that we are actually vying for the attention of employees to really be fully committed, to really be fully engaged with what they're doing as an employer. So I think that influences the general work practices that we need in the organization. Kind of stepping a little bit more into what do I do if my employees have got side gigs and they've got other interests as part of that. I think that has to be a very open conversation around what is the stance of the organization, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and let's have that conversation. Human beings, and I think that's something that in the post-pandemic world, people have got a lot of other ambitions that's not only necessarily tied towards one career or one job. I think the moment that we have to start hiding those things, I think it damages the trust relationship. So we should rather have a very open conversation to say what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and how are we going to manage this, in a fair way going forward, and what are the principles that we want to put down. And I think that helps, trying just to at least guide what that needs to look like, and having things in the open as opposed to, I slip away and I quickly go and do this. I mean, there's some horror stories of people having 3, 4, 5 jobs that they try to do exactly at the same time. I think that's not necessarily acceptable, but there needs to be a conversation about that.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that, Dieter. And I love that you, I think, have been pretty constant on like having those expectations up front and being clear about what's being expected and what's okay. And that can mitigate a lot of, people feeling like they should be doing something or shouldn't be doing something on that end. But Sarah, I would love to jump down to you and kind of get your thoughts. And then after you, we can maybe move up to Natalie.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I've definitely had a lot of personal experience with. So, when I was working full time, I also had several part-time jobs as well. So I was working full time in real estate, and then I had several part-time jobs in venture as I was, progressing my career in venture. And, even before I took that job, I was very open with the hiring manager and asking them if I'd be allowed to take part-time roles, what that would look like, what the rules were. And I think ultimately it comes down to setting those expectations because, you will have interests outside of your full-time job. And for me, I love venture, and ultimately I decided to leave my full-time role and focus solely on venture because it is something I'm really passionate about and I love. But I think ultimately, it's also about understanding how can those part-time roles actually add value to your current job, because a lot of the skills that I was developing in these part-time roles, I took those skills and I brought them back to my job because, a lot of what I was doing was analysis, looking at data, and I do that a lot in venture. And so I think if you can talk with your manager and be very open, like that was previously said, and say, hey, here's how I'm going to get my work done. I was still excelling at my job, but I was also doing these things outside of work. And ultimately it made me a happier employee because that company was very respectful of my interests, and I have so much respect for them, and I always will, because they supported what my goals were. So I think it's really just about, okay, like let's set expectations from the very beginning, and as long as you have that, I think it's very doable.
Absolutely, Sarah. Yeah, thank you so much for adding those points and kind of, infusing your own personal, past experience into ways that, companies can move forward, and also Gen Zs can kind of start having those conversations with the companies in that way. And Natalie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, like number one, like multiple gigs and Gen Zs being in multiple gigs is something we kind of have to do to even like to afford a living. I always like to bring up the cost of living is increasing, and that's dramatically increasing, but actually the amount of salary we're getting paid is kind of been the same over the past couple decades. So in order Gen Zs to kind of survive, we kind of have to have multiple jobs. So I think employers that don't realize this, they'll overall be losing a lot of top talent. For example, I have so many connections that work at all the top companies. They have nonprofits on the sides. They have startups. They all have all these stuff on the side, and it all like complements their job because they're posting about it. Number two is being a content creator. You're posting about all this stuff, and people are going to be like, oh my gosh, like Sally was like so awesome. Like she has this nonprofit. It really helped me. What company does she work for? And be like, I never heard of this startup. Oh, I never heard of this tech company. Maybe I want to apply because I see that they actually would support me running my own startup or having my own nonprofit, helping people in my community. So I think a big thing, like if you employers that don't realize this and they're like, why aren't Gen Zs applying to a job, or why are they leaving, is like, you have to accommodate this, because you can see this in future trends that this is only going to increase. So like you have to adapt.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Natalie. I really appreciate what you're saying there as well. And I think that also, begs to the reason as well to talk about is that a lot of the conversation around Gen Z currently within the workplace, and I felt this, and maybe the other Gen Zs have as well, is that a lot of these new practices have been seen as kind of a negative trend of Gen Zs. They're working other jobs, or they don't want to work 9 to 5, or they only want to work remote. And these have been seen and kind of are talked about in a lot of how do we fix this? How do we stop this? How do we mitigate this? But I think that is a really great way Natalie is thinking about it. How can this actually add to our company? How can this add to our startup? How can we leverage these other things that these Gen Zs are ambitious and going for and doing, and let them come into our company and have that innovation, have that ambition, and have that impact. And I think that's a really great way, I think definitely, Natalie, to bring that up and into the conversation. And Lisa, kind of to end off this question, do you have anything to add to?
Yeah, I think two things. One, I just want to underscore what Natalie said, right? Think about Peloton, right? Like that the Peloton instructors are able to do all of these, outside activities, and it attracts people to Peloton, right? So like, I think that that's really true. The other thing I would say, the benefit, if you're being clear on expectations and conflict of interest and all that stuff, is your Gen Z person who has a side gig is literally upskilling themselves on their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how can you, leverage that to see like you're building an internal pipeline, or wow, this person might be able to make this lateral move in a way that they might not have if they didn't have this experience. So I think that if employers can reframe it as this is encroaching on our time, saying let's get clear on what it is and how can we make this work for both of us, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate all of your all's thoughts on kind of that topic. And it looks like we had one last audience question that came up that maybe as, we're getting near the hour of our time, and it's been so great kind of hearing all of your all's opinions. So maybe we can jump on this question and go around and see if we have some answers, and then we'll wrap up for the audience. But our last question was, does bell curve normalization resonate with Gen Z? Within the context of a performance review. And so maybe this time we'll start with Lisa, if you've seen any of this, and then Sarah and Natalie, if you've had any experience, and then we can end with Dieter.
And so by bell curve normalization, meaning like I'm forced to put people in the top 20%, bottom 20%. Is that, am I understanding the question correctly?
I believe so. It was a little bit open-ended. So I think however that you have felt that has, come up or hasn't come up within, HR and the workplace.
I don't think it's come up per se in terms of forced ranking. I do not personally think it's super effective. I think you want to think through who is effective at different competencies, right? I think that's important. It's hard, right? Because if you have a team of really high performers, your bottom 20% is still really successful. So I don't see it as a really purposeful system. I do think it's important to always be assessing your human capital and thinking about strengths and challenges comped to your strategy and your goals. That is 100%. But forcing it into a bell curve is exactly that. I think it's forcing it.
Absolutely. And Natalie or Sarah, have you had any experience with this within the workplace, or is this something that you haven't really had to deal with a whole ton?
I haven't really had to deal with this. I think I'm very grateful for that, because I do feel like in a force, ranking, I think would, negatively affect me a lot, because I mean, just, growing up being in like a schooling system where we were forced to have ranking so much. I think that, I've definitely don't really like that. But I think ultimately it's like Lisa said, I mean, I think like if you have a lot of top performers and you do a ranking, it can negatively affect how they're feeling. And so I think, I'm like I said, I'm grateful that I haven't had to deal with that, but I feel like companies are shifting away from that for the most part, because they're trying to be innovative, and they're trying to, really appreciate the qualities that the unique qualities that every employee has.
Absolutely. And Natalie, do you agree?
Yeah, overall, I agree. I never heard of the term before, so it's like really new to me. Yeah, so I don't have any comments.
Absolutely. And Dieter, we'll finish off with you. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think everybody's kind of said what needs to be said around that. I think it's a very outdated practice, but I also think it fits in a particular context more on the reward side than on the performance side. It's about making those different links. I do think companies have started to shift away from that because it is more dialogue, outcome driven, and what that then looks like. And I think they're finding new ways to link performance to reward in a way that is, a little bit more conducive. I don't think that's a Gen Z challenge. I think it's a performance as a practice challenge, because nobody likes to be kind of going into a forced ranking type of system when they feel that they deserve something better or something else, or the communication thus far has been different. So no, I think it's a little bit of a more complex issue to unpack that I don't think we've got time for today. But no, I think there is a shift away from that.
Absolutely. Well, Dieter, Natalie, Sarah, Lisa, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much for Dextego for, really sponsoring this conversation and bringing us all together. I think that we learned so much and really talked about so much today. And I know that I have a lot to think about, and the audience does too. But thank you so much all for being here today. I think it was great. And so I think that is the end of our, live segment, but I really appreciate you all being here. And again, to the audience, thank you so much. If you have any last minute questions, please feel free to either send them in the chat and we'll work on, reaching out to you, or feel free to email any of us or email someone at Dextego, and I'm sure that we would love to get back to you and kind of have those conversations. And so thank you all so much for being here. And Dieter, Natalie, Sarah, Lisa, again, thank you for the great conversation. I know that will be so helpful, to the people in the audience. And I'm excited, just to chat with us about other people, after this is done, for sure. Really. And I think that we should be wrapping up in a minute. But until, this kind of ends, thanks to the audience, and appreciate, everyone being here as well, for sure.